My name is Ibrahim Adrame, and I'm the Director of Education at the Henry George School. We are very honored to have you here at our premises, and also we have a good audience online for this special panel on congestion pricing. So before I hand it over to our speakers, let me say a few words, not much, about the plan itself and highlight and provide a few highlights. So the policy as such is really nothing new because it's been implemented in many cities already around the world. Now, the town city of Singapore, the city-state of Singapore is usually cited as an example. But there are also many because London started implementing it, I believe, in 2001. And you have Milan in Italy, you also have Amsterdam, and also 2 cities in Sweden. So, but in the United States, New York is taking the lead once again. And the good news is also, I don't know, depending on how you see it, other cities are looking into the idea. You have LA, you have San Francisco, you have Seattle, you have Portland, and Chicago. So what is it about? So basically, in a certain area of the city, south of 60th Street, anyone who is driving in at certain hours would be charged a fee. So based on the actual numbers that we have right now, that's $9 to $23 during peak hours. And during overnight, that's from 8 p.m. to 10, 5 to 12, and 12 to 65 for small and large trucks like trailers. So the idea here is to leverage the powers of the price system in order to affect people's decisions to move from one area to another and to pick the most efficient transportation means. So if you are traveling during peak hours, you're gonna pay more. And if you are traveling by a trailer or by a truck, you are gonna pay even more. So of course, the idea also is to allow the MTA to be in a position to raise $1 billion a year in order to upgrade its system. Now, we must also understand that this is not just a fundraiser for government. Some of the impacts would be felt in the quality of the environment. Air pollution, for example, it is expected will go down. There will be more fluidity in traffic and therefore more mobility. As an example, when they implemented it in London, 1 year down the road, 30% improvement in congestion and a similar percentage in terms of the speed of the cars. And of course, the ridership on public transportation also improved by 38%. So which means that there is a connection between how you implement the plan and how much investment you do on public infrastructure. So, but this is not a plan that is easy because it's also raising lots of controversies. So some are questioning the very principle of the idea. Others are seeing it as unfair because it looks more or less like another regressive tax. So people who are not well off might bear the brunt of it. So that's the reason why we call on this panel. And we have 4 distinguished speakers. We have Denise Fevrul. She's a licensed real estate broker with the Corcoran Group. We also have Dr. Gevorkyan, who will be joining in from online, from Zoom. Alec is a professor of economics at St. John University. He also sits at the board of the Henry George School. We also have Dr. Marty Rowland, who is a senior fellow at the Asset Leadership Network. And last but not least, joining from Pennsylvania from an organization called Saving Communities is Mr. Dan Sullivan. So Marty, the floor is yours.
Well, appreciate the introduction, Ibrahim, and I'd like to welcome the other guests and the people online and people who are in person. It's an honor to be on this distinguished panel. I thought I would start out. I have like 7 minutes to give you a little 3 of my ideas, and I guess what I'm doing is in this time is to essentially say what Henry George would have said about congestion pricing. But before I get started, I want to make sure that people realize that I'm not speaking for New York City or the New York Parks Department. I only work there. But I'm a registered licensed professional engineer, educator, professor. But I did want to get into what Henry George would have said. For Henry George, this would be, congestion pricing would be the second best solution after the best policy of eliminating what he described very well, private property and land, allowing private ownership of everything else, which also allows private possession of land. Congestion pricing is an example of what he called government direction and interference, because we haven't eliminated the private property in land. Then we have to have we settle for the congestion that we have. So that's the idea that Henry George had, and we could get into more detail on that. But the issue is important because there's always need for additional money for MTA to improve their transit system. So if the congestion pricing doesn't come up with the, if we want to even improve, then we always can have what's called a land value tax. The issue is that had this policy been in effect for 143 years after Henry George announced it in 1879, we'd have 153 years worth of revenue to improve transit, and we wouldn't have gotten to the point where we did. And that's Henry George's idea. So my second idea is that MTA should respect industry best practices and follow the ASTM standard for infrastructure management of 15 types of public service, such as security, water, supply, education, healthcare, and use the community engagement aspect for transparency and accountability. This standard uses the infrastructure in a complex way, where change X ripples through the 15 universes, then ripple as a change becomes change X1, X2 in successive iterations. So this is an example of this is the higher charges placed on driving south of 60th Street may lead to more traffic on streets north of 60. So these are could end up being higher response times for police and ambulances and stuff. And then the last one, which is kind of like a recommendation, is to delay the congestion pricing for 1 year and do the following, which is install all the monitoring cameras and data collection, data linkages between the vehicles and their owners and special accounts, and see what happens without the pricing in effect, as if business as usual. Identify who, what, where, when, so that when the program goes into effect, they're not there then they could receive a check from the MTA paid by those who are there. So rather than just giving an abatement, to actually give them some money. So that's an idea I'm throwing out. A premium payment scheme should be those who run red lights, have don't pull over for emergency vehicles, those kind of things. I think that all Manhattan residents with cars at the start date should be excluded from the payment for the fee, and the cars should be data linked to their homes. So if they sell their homes, that they should that exemption should go with the property. And then lastly, well, not lastly, but residents should be allowed to assign their exemption to taxis and to run errands. So people who violate the rules that we set in place should be severely punished. So those are my introductory comments. I've looked at the history of how London successfully implemented them, and There's some very good lessons to be learned, which I won't get into now, but I'll just turn the floor over to Ibrahima.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marty. And Dan Sullivan is here. Dan, do you mind presenting now?
Well, I was mostly going to respond, but I have some thoughts on it. One is it's been a while since I spent significant time in Manhattan, and what I noticed back then was that street parking was free, and I don't know if it still is, but the street parking was free, but they had street cleaning from 2 to 4 on one side of the street and from noon to 2 on the other side of the street. And so there was this mad shift every day that people left their cars or pulled out of one side of the street and played musical chairs trying to get to the other side of the street. And so it struck me that the first thing they should do is charge enough of a rate for street parking that some people would give up parking on the street, and then there would be plenty of parking for the remaining people. They would have to pay for it, but they're paying now because they're paying with their time, leaving their place of work usually, and going out and playing car jockey once or twice a day. So that's one thing. The other is that Donald Shoup is the guru for this, but he's made a very strong case that if a street has, if the street is full so that people are circling the block looking for a parking space, then you're not charging enough for parking. And if the street is half empty, so that there's always parking, then you're charging too much for parking. And that the ideal price for parking should be such that that there's almost always 1 or 2 spaces on the street. So nobody has to circle the block, but no spaces are going wasted either. And not being from New York, I don't know if they have implemented any of that, but I think that should be a first step. There could also be a parking charge, and this includes for private lots, that you could put a tax on each parking space in a private lot, but the tax could be lower if the lot was equipped to charge for rush hour entry and rush hour exit. So you might have a fair, well, in New York, what's reasonable is higher than what's reasonable anywhere else. But you might have a rate of, $5 an hour or $10 an hour or something. But there could be an extra $10 charged if you pull in before 9:30. And an extra $10 charged if you leave after 3:30. And then that 3:30 charge could run till maybe 6:30, and then people who want to go see a show or something can arrive at 6:30 when the worst congestion is over and only pay the hourly rate. With today's meters, the hourly rate can also be lower in the evening if parking is not scarce in the evening. And so basically the rate should be higher wherever parking is scarce and whenever parking is scarce. So, but they should be predictable. One thing Donald Shoup has talked about is it's kind of like what Uber does with cab rides. If a street is suddenly crowded, then the next person to park has to pay, maybe $20 an hour or something. The problem with that is that a person can't predict what he's going to have to pay when he heads for Manhattan. So that was one thought. The other is that residents should be the first to give up parking, because if you live in Manhattan you can always rent a car for the few times that you drive out of Manhattan. So I have a problem with residential exemptions. You know, the residents are getting the greatest benefit from transit because once you live there, you know the transit system inside out. If I go to New York, it's a science project for me to figure out how to get somewhere on public transit. But it should be second nature to anybody who's lived there more than a month or two. So residents should be the first to go up transit and commuters should be second. And that's where the rush hour entry charge makes sense. And I saw in trying to find what was being proposed, I found a congestion charge for Uber and taxis and limousine drivers and stuff like that. And what struck me as odd is that the Uber drivers were charged, I think, $275, and the licensed taxis were only charged $250. And that also struck me as wrong because the licensed taxis get cab stand privileges that the Uber drivers don't get. So you'll have in front of hotels and other places, you'll have designated cab stands, and only the medallion owning licensed cab drivers can get that. So they're getting more and they're paying less. And if anything, Milton Friedman pointed this out, that government should be charging for the medallions, that the medallion speculators, well, they've taken a bit of a loss since Uber came along, but the medallion speculators were paying over $1 million to buy a medallion, and anybody who can pay $1 million to buy a medallion is not driving a cab. So what they do is they buy these things and then they levy a tax, the medallion owners levy a tax on the actual cab drivers in order to collect off this medallion. And it strikes me that the city of New York should collect off of the medallion. And the more the city of New York collects, the less the medallion owners will collect. It's not actually, it doesn't actually add to the price of a taxi trip. What it does is drive down the value of the medallion. It's exactly the same as land value tax doesn't drive up rents. It drives down what the landowner is going to be able to charge you to get a piece of land. So that was another thought. So yeah, my first thing is the third thing is that I don't, this might be in the proposal, but they put Interstate 80 right through New York City, which is not the fault of the trucker who's trying to drive to Connecticut. And so what I wondered is, when they charge truckers for entering Manhattan, do they charge them as they enter the interstate, or do they charge them at the exits? Because it's the people getting off in Manhattan with heavy trucks that should pay the lion's share of that charge. The people just driving through should be left alone. But I don't know the answer to that, so I figured I'd ask the rest of you guys. And that's pretty much my thoughts for the moment. I might have more as I hear more from the presenters.
Very good. Thank you, Dan. And now we'll pass it to Denise.
Thank you. Well, I can see right off the bat, I'm going to disagree with one of my colleagues on the panel. So that's a good thing, I think.
Exactly.
I'm
So it makes
actually
for lively discussion.
Yes, Dan, I'm coming for you. And I'm also going to consult my notes. I'm not going to be freeform because I made some important points. I don't want to miss anything, but I am actually here to give a perspective more from the real estate industry in New York, where we represent not only residents, but also business owners, and how this congestion pricing plan as currently proposed may be impacting those people. And I'm also speaking as a resident of below 60th Street and some of those concerns as well, so that you might be able to relate to. But I am seeing a lot of many conflicting predictions for how congestion pricing is going to impact property values in the zone, including both residential and commercial. In Singapore, for example, one of the cities that implemented the program successfully, congestion pricing led to a 19% drop in retail real estate prices. However, in London, the program resulted in a 3% increase in residential property values. So it's just interesting when you're seeing how this is impacting the different cities. And in London, I believe, Ibrahim, you would know, this was implemented in 2003. In London, was it 2003?
I think it was 2001. I'm not sure. I think
Many years of learning. So I'm really hoping New York is looking at these lessons learned for many years in London. So while the goals of reducing traffic congestion and improving our air quality through lower emissions is such an important mission for Manhattan, as currently proposed, the plan is imposing unfair, inequitable, and exorbitant costs on only a segment of Manhattan residents, those living below 60th Street. At the moment, there are no neighborhood or income exemptions cited in the current proposal other than an income exemption for those residents with a household income of $60,000 and below. And we're talking about $9, $23 peak hour fees is what's being presented. That's not small. There's only one neighborhood below 60th Street that has a median household income below $60,000, and that's the Lower East Side. In the Lower East Side, the median income is $53,000, but the average income is $82,000. So you are not talking about too many people who are going to be getting the benefit of an exemption. This is based on the 2020 Census Bureau survey. So while wealthier neighborhoods in zones like in neighborhoods like Tribeca, Soho, West Village, they may not feel the hardship of the increased cost of living that congestion pricing will bring, the residents of several other lower to middle income, once again, it's lower to middle income people. Those neighborhoods like Chinatown, East Village, Hell's Kitchen, Little Italy, parts of Midtown East, parts of Midtown West, they will be significantly impacted by the increased daily living costs and possible property value declines. So let me review just some of the major areas of concern with the current proposal that's, I'm at least just hearing from real estate industry colleagues. First, congestion pricing is representing a blatant display of wealth inequality, which is a major tenet of Henry George. And we're seeing it in the real estate industry in New York City every single day. Anyone who's reading the paper sees that, what's happening in New York City with rents and property values. The congestion fees achieve making driving more expensive for zone residents who can least afford it. Dividing the borough into within the zone and outside the zone further exacerbates a divide of unfair and inequitable costs pushed onto residents and property owners inside the zone. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. If this is progress and poverty, at its most blatant. While the rest of the Manhattan residents are exempt from this significant additional financial burden, but they will benefit. Another big concern is property values within the zone for individual and commercial owners will likely be impacted in different ways, depending on which zone and neighborhood you live in. So the lower middle income neighborhoods will now be more expensive to reside in. That will cause values of properties in these neighborhoods to decrease, and property owners will likely need to negotiate lower prices when looking to sell or rent their properties. But conversely, property owners in wealthier neighborhoods like Tribeca and Soho are hoping for increases in their property values and believe buyers and renters will pay a premium to live in a neighborhood with promised lower traffic congestion and better air quality. So you're just seeing this divide again between wealth and lower and middle income residents in New York City and businesses. Another concern, Manhattanites already tend to pay more for things related to daily living, such as, rent, groceries, parking, etc. Services that rely on truck deliveries for their businesses to operate successfully will likely need to raise their costs of goods and services in order to absorb the higher trucking costs, whose congestion fees will be passed on to them. Again, the lower middle income residents who are already struggling with very high inflation will bear the burden for the higher prices, whereas businesses operating in the wealthier zone neighborhoods believe their patrons will easily absorb these service increases. Also, the number of cars in the congestion zone may go down, but the use of for-hire car traffic like Uber and Lyft will likely increase, as it did in London. So additional surcharges are passed on to riders without the benefit of decreased traffic congestion. There is one hypothesis that the yellow cab business will slowly refrain from operations in Manhattan in the zone as cabbies will discontinue with their cruising for passengers in the congestion zone. So again, another depletion of service for those living below 60th Street. This could also impact property values in that zone. Now, from a commercial standpoint, the many auto garages operating in the congestion zone may struggle with lower income and lost business, as many of the car owners in the zone will choose to park their cars above 60th Street to avoid the tolls to cross out of the zone on their way to work for recreation. This is also a concern of the homeowners, by the way, who live immediately outside of the zone, who fear losing their parking options and seeing increased traffic in their neighborhoods. So parking garages just north of 61st Street will likely begin charging substantial premiums. And Dan, there are never any empty parking spaces in New York City, just so you know, never. Finally, many tri-state residents drive their cars into Manhattan for business or leisure because the city has failed to provide safe, clean, and reliable subway service as an alternative travel option. I mean, there are some people who are never going to go on the subway. It's scary. It's unsafe to many, many people, and they don't want to be underground. And all of this congestion pricing funding is going to improve the subway service. So at the same time, congestion pricing is planning to use this new revenue source to work on improved and safer subway service. The MTA is also still planning to raise fares again. So you've got this double whammy. So, we understand the conceptual mission of congestion pricing is an important one. Decrease traffic congestion in a concentrated, busy urban city center and cut down emissions, leading to better air quality for city dwellers. However, the New York City plan as currently proposed is insufficient in protecting all Manhattan residents, with appropriate exemptions that do not discriminate against lower middle income residents whose quality of life will be significantly impacted by likely decreased property values and increased cost of daily living. London keeps being held up as a shining example of how congestion pricing can be. But that program is way more nuanced after many years of experience and has many exemptions, such as car owners who happen to live in the London zone receive a 90% discount on congestion fees. That's nowhere in the current proposal for New York City. In fact, London is also currently looking at expanding the program to cover a much wider area of London, and New York should learn from this. Why just below 60th Street? Why is everyone below 60th Street being penalized? So New York City's Traffic Mobility Review Board should really consider how to structure the congestion fee program more equitably across the city to achieve its goals of cleaner air quality, less traffic, and more revenue to invest into the city's mass transit system. I mean, congestion pricing is coming. So there's, this is not an argument against it. It's more an argument of you've got to make it work for everyone, right? As in its current form, it's just really discriminatory. The current proposal unfairly punishes those residents and business homeowners living and working below 60th Street, me, with more expensive daily cost of living, as well as likely distress of home and business ownership prices. It's just another tax on hardworking New Yorkers. So hopefully New York City can launch a successful congestion pricing plan that will equitably work for all residents and business while achieving its important environmental goals. That is my hope. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Denise. And now let's hear from Dr. Gevorkyan from St. John's University.
Hi,
Alek?
Brahima. Thank you. And just like Marty, I should say I'm only speaking for myself, only on my behalf, and those are just the places I work with or affiliated with. So thank you for this invitation and welcome to the audience. And I'm listening to all my co-panelists. I'm a bit puzzled what it is that I can offer that's new. You pretty much touched on all important points. But I will try. As an economist, I will actually try to avoid numbers, but think in terms of more interconnected systems instead. Because economists have this kind of a magic sort of way of explaining things. The market will kind of take care of itself. You just impose a tax, impose a fee, and the market will sort itself out. But Denise mentioned several key points that connect to my remarks. And by the way, before I even continue, I should state the following. I very much am for a walkable city where you can walk and experience the neighborhood. And in the spirit of Jane Jacobs, I think this is something that is critical and defines New York City. So we should be very much appreciative of that. And it is with that appreciation as well that I will just in a moment will continue. I also take the train, I take the subway for my regular commute, but at the same time I drive on occasion. So I guess my remarks are kind of coming from this mix of all these different interactions and the views that we have and probably share about New York City. What Denise mentioned, although, is very, very important for a lot of people to understand, and that is that New York City is not the postcard Empire State Building neighborhood. It is actually much more. It's a massive economy, bigger than many countries in the world. And this massive economy is comprised of 5 boroughs, which are interlinked through roadways, but also train system, subways, and the buses. But let's just stay with the subway. And for the actually significant large part and portion of the New York City, which is not appearing on the congestion pricing maps, right? The major way of communicating and crossing from one neighborhood to another is actually by driving. There's also an option for a bus, but the realities are, and I'll try to minimize the micro comments, but the realities is that it's not necessarily the most pleasant option when it is raining and windy at the same time and snowing, and someone is trying to get to a job interview, let's say, all dressed up and at their best.
Or when you need to carry packages, things like that.
Well, I'm not even getting into that, because then you have, okay, so we have a group of different, not just those people who may just dislike the subway. When you live in New York long enough, you meet a lot of different people of different interests, and there are those who just don't understand how you can take the train. You should always be driving. So let's be reasonable somewhere in the middle. But indeed, carrying packages, the answer to this might be, well, delivery. But delivery is another cost, right? Which you have to pay and takes out some flexibility. But but my major point for now, at least the first point, I think, is to connect with Denise's comment about, she put it really well, dividing the borough. And that has a very significant effect, not just from real estate perspective, not just from revenue generation or environmental concerns, but a socioeconomic effect as well, which affects quality of life, which affects, those are intangible things which economists cannot measure, and that is why they often are falling out of the calculation. At the same time, a concept such as congestion pricing may be beneficial in the longer term as for the purposes of again changing the behavior, right? De-incentivizing use of cars with some greater goal in mind. So we have here at least one goal which was presented in the introduction, and that is the environmental and minimizing exhaust and pollution, which is a very serious concern for the city. But it should be noted, of course, that technology and in general, the economic progress is such by definition that it doesn't stay stagnant, right? It changes. And a lot of newer model cars have automatic shut off. And so there's already some type of somewhat probably small, but contribution to reducing the pollution when cars are idling. Some time ago, New York City adopted a regulation which limited the curb idling to 3 minutes. So these days, if the car has this automatic shut off, engine shut off, then there's no exhaust. But if the goal is just revenue generation, then again, going back to Denise's point, this has a very detrimental effect on the larger group of New Yorkers. In fact, in one of the documents with this proposal that's been put out there, there's a paragraph that states it is actually the lower middle income groups and lower income groups that will be most affected and burdened by this. So again, economists come to this with a view that, okay, that these residents will just have to move out and kind of free up space for higher paying residents. And in kind of this sort of cynical economics logic, it works, but we realize that's not the right way, or at least I think so. There's another problem with comparisons to other cities, I think, and it comes from a couple of sort of points of view, because I actually had a few more things to mention, but my co-panelists touched on some of them. And again, my remarks should not be taken as being against congestion pricing in principle, no, but what needs to be done probably a bit more of an assessment of how this current plan would be, sort of the consequences of this current plan for New York City. So a couple of things. Number one, it is important to understand geography of New York City. It is an island, both, whichever way we look, right, from Manhattan to Staten Island to Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx may be getting some leeway here, but still their water is around these areas, and there are just few crossings into Manhattan. And for anyone living east of Manhattan, the way to get to the western part of the Hudson River, even if we just take the New Yorker's famous cover, there is something beyond the river. You have to most likely cross Manhattan. Now, the response to this would be, well, you can go around Staten Island or again, the Bronx. Already, those roadways are jam-packed with traffic without any congestion toll pricing or anything like this going into effect. What was mentioned by co-panelists is that introducing congestion toll or pricing at below 60th Street would result in more cars diverting into those already busy roadways. And then what Denise also mentioned in her remark is that this will have a significant detrimental effect to quality of life for the residents in the boroughs through which those cars will be traveling. Whether it's through parking or people trying to go around the traffic, taking smaller streets, and so on. That's the problem about socially dynamic systems. They build up, and the urban economy and the problems build up. And the problem within New York City is that. So so these are all very serious, I think, concerns to be discussed rather than focusing on the possible end result. Right, so it's fine, but the means to the end result should be very carefully addressed. And with that, and again, that's connecting with the dividing the borough, it should be a system-wide solution. What Denise mentioned about London is important. What we know about Singapore is that it's ranked second or first best public transportation system in the world. Well, then if you have something like this, then you can impose $100 congestion pricing, and it would not really matter as much, right? So instead, this solution should be to start this subway. I'm strictly with subway, but of course there are other Long Island Railroad, buses, is to start with those improvements, I think. Why is it that people have this perception that subway is not safe? Well, this has to be addressed. Part of it is public relations campaign, but bigger part of it is, of course, predictability of how trains operate and certain basic expectations. And usually when I mention something like this, the answer is you should have seen the subways in the 1980s. I've seen that in the movies, but that is not a valid defense in the 21st century when there are benchmarks out there on the international scale and even on the national scale. For example, you land into pretty much almost any airport, major airport in Europe, and chances are you will be able to go down into the tunnel and take the train that directly takes you to the city center. You don't need to change trains, carry your luggage. Right now, we have something like this just for JFK, but even then you have to transfer, right? So I always feel sorry for the folks on the E train when I see them, because that is, it is, you can see fear in their eyes. Where are we? What is going on? And I mean, that's how it is. We're okay. But for somebody who is used to a very different pattern of public transportation in terms of its functionality, it takes some type of adjustment. So I think, but the question to the subway improvement is, well, there's no money. Well, we are already paying part of the sales tax that goes towards MTA. And if we are thinking about improvements for everyone, this is not a popular proposal, but maybe if there is no absolutely any other way to find the money, it is maybe to raise the sales tax, maybe to some round number. Because if we just leave it to the congestion pricing as a hope to raise certain amount of funds, then we are actually sort of socializing the risk, to borrow from the discussions from the global financial crisis, but limiting the gains. By socializing the risk or the burden, that's the drivers, Uber drivers as well, and passengers and so on, who would be contributing to the fund, and however great it's going to be or large and so on. But the benefits would really be just for that section of the city. And Denise mentioned in her remarks the problems with that. And we are all, especially those who live in the city, are familiar with the inequalities that sort of persist across the boroughs. And I don't think this will be helping us. In urban economics, there's a concept of leapfrogging development. When a portion within an urban area, one portion gets developed, then another portion is skipped, and then the next is developed. For example, well, let's leave the examples out, but it is a risk. It becomes a risk then for New York City's sort of cohesive and kind of overall urban integrity. At the same time, I'm not defending or stating that everyone should be just driving 24 hours a day. No, what needs to be also changed is the behavior in terms of driving. And this is for someone else to figure out how to suggest this. But because I have a very annoying habit of talking to the drivers, unlike Elaine Bennis and Seinfeld, everywhere I go, I try to learn something. And it was in Dublin that the taxi driver told me, to my question, why are things moving relatively smoothly? The answer was very simple. If everybody obeyed the rules, then things would have been okay. I mean, we have so many nuanced situations in the city that do not get addressed, that would actually simplify and relieve the congestion problems. Not even the double parking is the easy part, but the double parking of, let's say, delivery vehicles or emergency vehicles, this could be resolved by opening up some space from parking to Dan's point, instead of just removing 2 spots next to the building's service doors, right? So this removes already a delivery car out of the blocking the roadway and lets the traffic pass. So these are my thoughts. But then, and then lastly, this was mentioned by Dan about the cab stands. We need to account for changes in consumer preferences and consumer behavior. And it's not a guarantee that if the yellow cab is there, somebody will jump into it, especially if they're not from New York, especially at the hotels. They will most likely will try to do something that is familiar, and that is called Lyft or Uber. I think that aside from the reasons why there's a difference in the congestion fee, so I think kind of obeying the rules, driving habits, and looking at this question from a sort of city systemic point of view. So these are just my thoughts. Again, I don't want to change completely, sort of start a revolution here, but I think it is worth keeping these complexities in mind. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alec, and thank you, of course, all our panelists. There are a couple of questions in the chat here. One is, how else would you fund mass transit? Well, my favorite candidate would be the land value tax, the land value capture especially. But if you have any, I guess that question was addressed to Alec. Do you have any other alternative?
The idea that I had was the sales tax increase from, what is it, 875? I'm forgetting, but to 10%. That's possibly one. It's not going to be a commonly accepted idea, but still the exemptions, let's say on clothing or some food items, would apply. And it would be a little bit more of a kind of transparent and more inclusive way of doing this, because it'll affect a greater number of people who would be benefiting from the MTA improvements or subway improvements.
Sure.
Otherwise, you have just a small group that is paying for those improvements, which probably is unfair. But to Ibrahim's point on the land value tax, well, then, Denise, then within this zone, however you'd like to refer to it, 60th Street and below, the land value taxes have to go up, or property taxes would have to go up. Because generally, if a neighborhood becomes relatively nicer with improved, let's say, quality of life, in this case measured by lower congestion, right, it should drive property prices higher.
Yep.
And so this is where the land value tax might be appropriate, probably.
Thank you.
But there are many other ways how to look for money in New York City, and that can be found.
Can I just make a comment here?
Yeah, go ahead, Denise.
You keep driving the taxes up, more people are going to move out and no one's going to be here to use the subway.
No, but I'm only talking about sales tax, nothing else. There's already
It
a
doesn't
premium.
matter. I mean, people are feeling overtaxed enough in New York City.
Yes, so
And
there's already a premium.
Somebody made a comment earlier about, well, you know, people who can't afford it are just going to have to move and let wealthier people come in the city. Honestly, I can't even believe I heard that comment. I don't know where it came from, but you know, that's like just pushing out middle class, lower class New Yorkers and making this just a city full of wealthy people. It's just
That's the thing. So that was
acceptable.
exactly. So that was my example of what might be a possible result, which is not the desirable outcome here.
Out there.
Right.
Okay.
I mean,
I
the desirable outcome would be for everyone to have their incomes go up, but New York City has imposes a premium, right, with
Why
various
we
taxes.
lost a lot of population.
All right.
I
There is a
Couple thoughts
question.
on that.
Oh, okay, Dan, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, one is that a lot depends on how you do it. Dave Wetzel, who a lot of us know, and I've talked to him about this, he introduced transport. He was the vice president of transport for London in charge of the congestion charge. And he said the congestion charge is not a revenue generator.
Okay.
The purpose was to rationalize transit or rationalize driving, so that the people to whom driving was the most valuable would drive, and they would then be free of the congestion. So instead of circling the block for an hour to find a parking space, if you wanted to go into a business and buy something and it took you half an hour to buy it, and they're charging $10 an hour for congestion for parking, then you would have to pay $5 for half an hour to park. But if your time was worth $10 an hour or more, then not having to circle the block for half an hour trying to find a space makes the $5 payment worthwhile. And the concept was basically, if you try to raise money from these congestion charges significantly beyond the cost of administering the congestion charges, then you'll probably screw it up. And there is a good chance that that New York will try to milk this for revenue to fund transit or whatever. And that probably won't work, because the whole point of the congestion charge is to reduce the number of people who would be paying the congestion charge. And
Right.
if you go beyond that, and you go beyond that to the point that your parking spaces are empty, then maybe you're costing businesses a lot of money. The other reason I like charging for parking before you do these territorial congestion charges is that even if you end up doing the charge, what would happen is that if people had to pay a congestion charge to cross 60th Street, then the parking rates would go up north of 60th Street, and they would go down south of 60th Street to offset the congestion charge. So the parking aspect, the parking charge aspect is necessary even if you do the congestion charge, but you should do the parking charge first. And until you've done so much parking charges that there's always a space on the block, and the other thing is you can adjust it block by block. So the parking charges can go down the further you get from Central Park, the further you get from the Wall Street financial sector. The parking charges would probably be less in the Lower East Side or Hell's Kitchen or whatever, and would probably be less as you went north of Central Park. So you don't have to have a hard border. You can have parking charges that are lower at 60th Street and lower still at 70th Street and lower still at 80th Street until you get to the point where there's free parking because there's not that many people that want to park there. And it might be in New York, there are no such places. I know Brooklyn is always packed for parking.
I can't believe New York City has not looked at this parking
Aspect.
scenario
Yeah.
before.
Definitely.
I don't know
But
any
the
background
parking-
on it, but it's not like they've never looked at it before.
Yeah, but the big advantage of charging market rates for parking is that you don't have this hard border between 60th Street, between north of 60 and south of 60.
Yeah.
So that's the
but-
second thing. The third thing is that I'm trying to figure out, I know that there are lower middle income groups living in Manhattan, but are there lower income groups that own cars in Manhattan? Or is there a significant number of car owners in those lower income groups? And if they have to drive to work if they have to drive outside of Manhattan to get to work, which is the only reason they couldn't take transit to work, then maybe they should live outside of Manhattan so that their
That's,
commute is
you're
a lot
asking
less.
people to move. That's just not
That's like
Yeah,
acceptable.
to me that, yeah, to me, I'm sorry, that's
Green
something that
gentrification,
is,
yeah.
Not-
that's been happening in New York, unfortunately, but it's been causing rupture across the communities, right? And the whole concept of neighborhood and urban economy just kind of disappeared.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure.
Well, I'm not asking people to move. I'm asking them to, their car imposes a social cost. And I'm asking them to pay that social cost. And the flip side of that is,
So ask them throughout the whole city, why below 60th Street?
oh, I absolutely agree with that. The
Right.
parking should pay market rates in the entire, all 5 boroughs,
Yes.
wherever there's an absence of parking.
Mhm.
And a lot of the congestion is people circling the block looking for
The thing is,
thought.
I'm
Say we have a lot.
not
Okay.
really sure.
Dan, we have a lot of questions, so let me, let's
Yeah, I'm not
move.
sure.
Okay, well, I
Parking.
got one short point, which is that all taxes drive down the benefit of living there and doing business there. And
Actually-
it definitely includes the sales tax. So what I want to know with New York is, are they just doing this to get more money, or are they going to lower some other tax because they imposed this tax?
I
No,
think
no
in the
taxes
proposal,
lowered.
it clearly states that this is revenue generation, and then which would allow then the MTA to borrow 15 billion, which is a number from 2019 of pre-pandemic times. So this is not really about parking, and then
Right.
circling for parking is really a minor topic within this. I think it's more really about there's a lot of cars out there. With rideshare especially, and the rideshare drivers are those low middle income drivers that are out there and across the city. But there's another, I'll let Ibrahima get to the questions, but there's another bigger topic here that goes back to the inclusiveness and so if we have time at the end, I'll talk.
Thank you, Alec. We have lots of questions. This one is, I believe, from Rick Ryback. He said, the speaker from the New York real estate community, that would be you, correctly notes the inequities that arise from arbitrary tolling boundaries. Could these inequities be eliminated or mitigated by substituting a distance-based and congestion-based fee in lieu of a charge for crossing some arbitrary boundary? But any of the panelists, you could answer if you want.
Well, I have to say, I'm not an expert on congestion pricing, so, and I'm not an economist, so I'm just objecting to the way the proposal is currently discriminating. If somebody else on the panel wants to take that, I did mention that I don't understand the divide below 60th Street if the entire borough was perhaps sharing this responsibility. That might, be a way to consider. I can't believe that the transit committee has not looked at this. I just I don't have that information. I just can't believe this hasn't been looked at. I'm just not understanding the discrimination on the below 60th Street.
There's probably technology behind it. I just don't know it well, but if there is a way to figure out the zip code for the license plate, right? So then you know how far it's coming from New York City. Then you could introduce the different varying toll fees, right? And anything from outside of New York City gets charged more. But the residents of New York City are already paying tolls. Anyone who's, and again, this should not be taken as a defense for driving. I would prefer to minimize the amount of driving on my part, for example. But nevertheless, if you, but it is quite telling in terms of behavior of what we're seeing. If you're entering the city from Queens, there are a couple of options. One is take the Queens Tunnel. The other is to take the bridge. And there's a line of cars piling up, getting onto Long Island Expressway, which is a long way before you get to actually at Queensboro Bridge. So they're on a daily basis, on an every minute by minute basis. So there's already massive congestion there. And again, this example
Do
is
they-
only just, it's an example only just to tell the behavior, not again to say that driving is the best thing ever. But it is for the reason to avoid paying tolls in Queens Tunnel. Right?
Are there higher tolls at rush hour at Queens Tunnel? Or are they the same all day long?
They're all
They are all the
standard.
same.
They're all
I
standard.
think it's
and
the
those are
same.
going up as
Yeah.
well.
There
Could
was
you-
an attempt, I think, to have a higher. I don't remember that. Marty.
And
might
in the
know.
middle of the night, they could be free. I mean, it's just. Congestion
tell you don't
charges
live
make
in
a
New
lot.
York.
That's
You can tell
that's
you don't
another
live in
thing.
New York, Dan.
Dan, let me read a question here from the audience. The West Side Highway plus the FDR Drive will be exempt from congestion pricing. When you leave these zones to access bridges and tunnels, does anyone know if once you drive on the streets, will the charge apply?
So are you asking, so say your car is parked on, you live on Broadway and 14th Street. And so you're gonna take 14th Street to the West Side Highway where it's exempt. But what about you getting from 14th and Broadway to the, I have no idea if that,
I think you will be. I think you will be
You
charged.
will be charged, yes.
I
because
think.
it is about access to the city. So once you cross Queensboro Bridge and get onto FDR, let's say, and then continue on FDR, but downtown, and then get it into the streets in downtown, then come back to the FDR. Somehow, somewhere, there's going to be that
There's gonna be
camera.
a charge. Yes,
Exactly.
I believe so.
Yeah, so the perimeter streets like FDR, those are just, bypassing a lot of the center street.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. So they would
But you
go
have
out
to get to
there and
those.
then just go in and out. And, it's a matter of how they calculate the going in and out. So I guess that's why I proposed a period before the implementation where you can actually run a simulation in real time and say, this is what would have happened if we implemented it 3 months ago. You could play those kind of games. But
Thanks.
I did want to hear Rick's question again. I didn't quite get it.
Okay, we'll get to that. We have too many questions, Marty. I'll read it to you later when the panel is done, okay?
Okay.
All right, so this one is from Michael Murray online. If the purpose of congestion pricing is to rationalize driving behavior, why not channel the incremental revenue into general funds for whatever needs the city needs to meet, instead of targeting the funds at the bloated, inefficient bureaucracy that is the MTA. And if the goal of congestion pricing is to fund improvements in mass transit benefiting commuters, why not just reinstate the commuter tax or increase state income taxes instead of punishing residents of the congestion pricing zone?
Well, I got an answer to that.
Okay, go ahead, Marty.
Okay, well, the idea that's being worked here, and it's what was done for London, is that you first off, the word congestion is in all these schemes. So if you don't reduce congestion, then it is just a big scam, and so you have to have an outcome that it's what you're going for. And so if you do get the reduced congestion, then you have to provide the opportunity for other means of getting around. And like in London, they expanded the bus service so that there was a direct connection between people not driving and people taking the bus. So they had to do something that was a good switchover. So, this is the Henry George School. So, the thing that's missing is that we're not adequately collecting the revenue from the land value. And that's how all transit systems around the world work, like we talked about Singapore, Tokyo, Hong Kong. They don't rely on fees. That's crazy. You fund your transit by the land value at the transit stops. And anybody who thinks otherwise just doesn't know what the literature is about. So, we're missing the opportunity that's out there. And I think I would like to just give a plug to the real estate industry that Denise is part of, because they've come out in favor of the congestion taxes that we're talking about, with the idea that the land values would go up. They'd go up if you reduce the congestion. So this is actually a good backdoor for a Henry George type land value taxation scheme, where we have the real estate industry backing the congestion pricing, which reduces congestion, which should increase home values, which includes the land value. And then you could take the tax off of buildings, and then that might be the way that we generate the revenue that we need for all these services.
Mhm. But you need the appropriate exemptions
Yeah, and I
to
mentioned all the
protect other people, because, as somebody who lives below 60th Street,
Yeah,
who
yeah.
also is a subway rider, I do not have a car, and I'm on the subway every single day. And I'm in the East Village, and I'm now having to, consider my cost of living increasing again, because all the services in my area will be passing on their fees from their truckers or from the Ubers I have to take sometimes, et cetera. So,
Well,
I'm being penalized for using public transportation.
that's why I advocate for all residents to actually get a check in the mail when they stop driving. But so the people who live there aren't the ones that created the congestion. It's people from the outside, and that's really what we should be looking at.
Oh, actually, I would disagree with this. With the people, first of all, we don't know, but second, it is quite feasible to suggest that people who live there take a lot of trips. In fact, early on in this whole big data kind of conversations, this would be 10 years ago, there were attempts to estimate trips. Most of the trips by the yellow cab trips would originate in downtown and somewhere up closer to Upper West Side, Upper East Side.
Yeah.
That was the majority, almost. Well, I don't want to give a number, but it was more than 50% of yellow cab trips during a day, and we can imagine there are millions of those trips.
But
Yeah,
that's
so-
because those garages, that's where the taxi cab garages reside.
No. It's people
Downtown.
hailing.
And on the Upper West
No, it's
Side.
people hailing it's the passenger traffic.
But without the data, we're just blowing.
But the
We don't
data,
know
but
what the
that's what I'm
numbers-
saying. The data is out there. The data is out there. It's easily captured, and
No, I think what I'm talking about is implement the system as if it's active, collect the data, and then you could be accurate.
yes,
in what-
there has to be some type of quiet sort of testing. But another pilot project could have been to start with the sort of New York City urban boundary, sort of anything that is 5 boroughs, that's kind of movement within the boroughs is free, there's not taxed or there's no toll, but anything coming from the outside, that's when you have to pay, whether you're a resident or not resident. That would be a little bit more fair, at least to all New York City residents.
Okay.
Here
is another question from the audience here. What about people who may be physically challenged and
Exactly.
don't own cars, but need to visit doctors, hospitals? This includes the elderly, as well as others. Shouldn't they be exempt when they are unable to take public transportation?
They are
that's
exempt
the current
according to the
proposal.
plan, right?
Yes.
They're exempt according to the plan, but the way you prove the exemption is by having a paper. But to get the paper, not everyone has this a paper exemption.
That's
Right.
the problem.
Someone may not be feeling well to get on the train, so they're asking a friend to drive, or they carpool with a friend. How is this sort of? Where's the doctor's notice? It becomes really
Yeah,
odd at the end.
they have to get the to Alex's point, you have to get the paper, but that is in the current proposal that there will be exemptions for those circumstances.
Yes, but some people are capable of moving around, they're independent, but they're not as energetic, let's say, as they may have been some time ago. It would be for psychological reasons, they wouldn't want to get this paper confirming they have a disability.
Yeah,
It is possible, right? Of course, somebody might say those are minor cases, but then again, we're talking about creating a livable environment for this in the city. And again, cars are not necessarily the solution, but for now, that's what we have.
Ibrahima, before we take another question, I wanted to make sure I had time to pose one thing before we close, is our prognosis of whether this thing actually will work. And I guess my point, going back to London, is that London had a very strong, influential mayor who had the authority to do what he did. He had the financial resources, and he had a lot of independence. He didn't need permission from anybody else. So that's a very unusual situation that London had, that I'm not sure that we can really, well, actually it was a person who was really championing the thing. And I don't think we have that combination in New York City, but I just throw that out, whether we talk about it now or later.
Yes,
He
but
was defeated.
you also had a good collaboration between former Governor Cuomo and former Mayor de Blasio, who worked together to make it happen here in New York City. Right?
The mayor of London was defeated not long after he did that, though. So whether that contributed to the defeat or not is a separate
I'm not
question.
saying that he was good forever, but at the time it was implemented, that's how he pulled it off. And I don't think that we're going to be able to pull it off to get any experience.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, one more question from the audience here. Should we treat the MTA as a landlord? And would it be possible to find ways to incentivize them to be more efficient and effective? So
That is a great question. And anyone who walked Brooklyn Bridge in 2005 in December during the strike should think about it. Because at the time, people sympathized with MTA's demands, but at the same time, it was a major difficulty for a lot of people. And being in that crowd, crossing the bridge, kind of makes you wonder, how could the system work so that clearly the MTA workers' demands are met, but at the same time, the rest of the city also continues to function.
Yeah, I wasn't here in 2005. What was that?
It was an exciting time.
Sometime.
The MTA went on strike, subways stopped running, and as a way to, and again, if you live within a walkable distance, Midtown or just in general Manhattan, things are easier significantly. If you lived somewhere in the Bronx, Staten Island especially, or Queens or Brooklyn, I will refuse the word outer boroughs. Outside of Manhattan, then as an exception, what was, I don't remember how it was worded, but basically yellow cabs started to actually pair passengers. In other words, if somebody was hailing a cab and they were going to Brooklyn and then there's somebody else, the yellow cabs had the permission to stop and pick as many passengers as they could fit, I think, or maybe it was a limit of two.
I remember that.
I could be wrong about that. But by the way, there's something in that sort of, I guess, rideshare companies present this as an innovation, kind of car share.
that's a form of socialism.
Yeah.
No, it's a form of living in an urban setting. You have to share.
Yeah.
A subway train car is not your living room. It's not for nail clipping. It is a public space where you have to share. And
I want to.
basically but that's what urban form is. where you walk the streets, and by definition you have to yield, or you will bump into something or someone. That is why this conversation is difficult, because on the one hand, I understand the need to relieve the congestion, but on the other hand, the way it's done, I think it may be impacting people disproportionately.
Definitely.
To the question, I wanted to note that if you funded transit from land value tax, you would not only, I mean, the purpose of transit is to make land valuable by making it accessible. That's also the purpose of roads. But if you're funding the transit from land value tax, then it automatically becomes efficient, because the transit person says, is adding another late night train to New Rochelle going to increase land values by the cost of adding the train? Or should we worry less about New Rochelle and improve transit in the city so that so people can go anywhere, anytime in the city? And that question can be economically analyzed by what will that do to the land values? And so there is that benefit. There's also an anomaly in giving exemptions. Suppose one person lives in Manhattan and wants to visit his friend in Staten Island, and he gets on his Manhattan roads and makes the same trip as the guy who lives in Staten Island, and wants to visit his friend in Manhattan. And what exemptions for residents says is the person driving to Manhattan has to pay a higher charge than the person driving from Manhattan. So I question whether that's really fair. It's shifting the burden away from the Manhattan residents to the residents elsewhere. And the same thing is for parking. If you give resident exemptions from street parking, then the person in Manhattan gets to park for free and drive to Staten Island, and the person in Staten Island does not get to park in Manhattan for free. So
right, and the benefits accrue to Manhattan residents.
Yeah, at the expense of others, because the cost has to be higher to raise the same revenue if you're going to do that.
Ibrahim, I don't see any questions. Are there more?
Okay, this one is more of a comment than a question. Quite helpful, I believe. Please point out that it is by no means certain that congestion pricing, as actually implemented or actually planned, will actually include proposed exemptions for the handicapped or others not able to use mass transit. There are many groups, including, I believe, the Riders Alliance, that have come out against all exemptions.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's an important point, and I wanted to add to Dan's statement earlier, because with exemptions already, so now this idea of congestion pricing in New York has been discussed since former Mayor Bloomberg, right? And immediately almost the different groups, and we know how kind of New York City is New York City. There are a lot of groups that are quite strong and voiceful. So immediately exemptions were being discussed. Mm-hmm. So then once you award one type of exemptions, how do you decide when to stop and not to award another type of exemption? This is why I think basically saying, fine, let's go with congestion pricing, but it's the congestion pricing to enter New York City. There are already tolls, but those tolls are paying for maintenance of bridges and tunnels, but then this is would be another fee. So it's not what is it? I don't remember, $16 to cross the bridge or something, but it will be, let's say, $20.
Yeah, which is already high.
Yeah.
Right, but again, it would to the earlier question from the audience, it could be set up so it varies depending on the residency. So if it's a New York City resident entering New York City from New Jersey, then it's not, what did I say, $25, it's, let's say, $20. And I'm just giving numbers as an example. There's no calculation behind it.
Good.
Yeah, I
Go ahead,
just
Dennis. Yeah, sure.
If I were someone who had to come into Manhattan from, say, the Bronx or Jersey for my business, every day. I would now be thinking about just coming into the Upper East Side or Upper West Side and parking there and then doing my business in the city. Because I'm already paying a bridge toll or a tunnel toll. And since FDR and West Side Highway will be exempt, I'm not going to pay another price. I would be worried if I were on the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side that you're going to get a lot more traffic congestion up there and no
Yes.
parking spaces, because that's what I would do for sure.
Yes, that exactly is the point, that there will be more traffic moving into those areas that are not tolled. That's why you either do everything or none.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Diversion effect or deflection
But
effect.
there is a reason why this section was chosen. I'd like to mention a few words on this at the end.
Yeah,
we bring
okay.
up
that would
the-
be good.
So there is another comment from Michael Murray. As a University of Chicago trained economist, I can state definitely that the purpose of roads and mass transit is most definitely not to raise land values. The increase in land values is a consequence of the other benefits of lowering the cost of moving people and goods from point A to point B. So
what's
that
the,
sounds like the
sounds
sort of
like-
comment that Dan or Marty would want to answer.
Well, no, I think he was.
Yeah,
responding to-
it sounds like he fails to make the connection between the desirability of a location and its value. I mean, a location is desirable if you can move goods and things to it. It's not an either or. It's like the purpose of the police is to make crime go down, not to raise land values. But wherever crime goes down, land values go up.
Values go up.
Mhm.
There's a, you know, you can focus narrowly and say this is the purpose, but then you're losing the economic reality that places that have access to lots of roads are always the most valuable places.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So-
same
Good
thing with
point.
lower congestion. So lower congestion is a better place to live, and that's why the real estate industry is in
Yeah.
favor. And the only point I was trying to
Provided that they don't overdo it. If they get a congestion charge that goes beyond what's necessary to lower congestion and they start trying to
Move.
generate revenue from it, then it'll lower land values.
Yeah, then they're
Right.
screwing up.
Exactly.
Exactly. So we have about 7 minutes. So if you have some closing comments to make, I understand Alec wanted to state something.
But I yield to my panelists, and I will come at the end.
Okay, no problem. So you want to go, Marty, or you want to have Denise? Go?
I can go now. I
Okay.
think that I'm in favor of the congestion pricing. I think that it can be done. And I think with the exemptions, we can have something that's equitable. But I do have to repeat myself and say that what was found to be necessary in London and what was by default was in effect in Singapore, which is a authoritarian government, which can do quite a bit.
That was in the past, maybe 20 years ago, not anymore.
But yeah, I mean, still, it's more authoritarian than New York City, let's say. So I guess that the point I was trying to make is that in London, they had that strong person that didn't have to, and very influential, and didn't have to beg any other politician. And he had, that was Ken Livingstone, and he was able to pull it off because he was a champion. But I don't see a champion out there that's gonna be, putting this thing in place. I don't see Mayor Adams being the champion for this. If somebody can point out who that champion is, that'd be a good discussion.
Thanks, Marty.
Good point.
Denise?
Well, I'm also in favor of the concept of congestion pricing, less congestion in the city, better air quality, but as currently proposed, it is just, to me, reinforcing the have and have nots situation in New York City that already exists in the real estate industry. And now you're just adding fuel to that fire, and the division of the borough is is the thing that I feel really needs to be looked at. It should be shared. It should be shared across the entire borough. The goal to end congestion, because I do think above 60th Street will actually be suffering more than they're realizing, because people will avoid below 60th Street.
Of course. Thanks. Dan, I know Alex wanna come last.
Yeah, I agree with the objection to hard borders for this. And that's part of the reason that the parking charge is an ideal starting place for congestion charges, because it would gradually reduce as you went further from the prime areas. I generally don't like exemptions. Quite often there are other ways to handle it. We can give aid to the handicapped, and a person who is not formally handicapped but has is having a bad day and feels ill, well, he can take a taxi that day, and it's not as big a burden on him as an exemption for the entire year is a burden on the congestion approach. So those people, if they frequently have problems, they can apply for a handicap plate, and you could charge less for a handicap plate. The other thing is that we have in Allegheny County, which is greater Pittsburgh, we have services specifically for the handicapped that are run through the transit authority. So handicapped people get a subsidized ride to the doctors or to other places that the rest of us can't get. We get on a regular bus. They have a multi-passenger van that comes and picks them up and locks their wheelchair in place if they ride in a wheelchair. So, there's always other approaches. And finally, the idea of funding things with the sales tax, New York City and one or two places in California have the highest sales tax rate in the country. And there's already buses that go into Manhattan every day to take people to shopping centers in New Jersey. And people go to these shopping centers in New Jersey because the tax is significantly lower in New Jersey than it is in Manhattan. So I think you end up trying to, I think New York City, more than any other place in the country, needs to go to land value tax because it is the most overtaxed city on productivity anywhere. And we've known this since John Locke in the 1600s, which is that every tax ultimately lowers land values. And every government service ultimately, unless it's a really stupid one, ultimately raises land values. So for the people of Manhattan, you say, do you want a higher land value tax, or do you not want the transit improvements? And either way, the transit improvements should increase the value of being in Manhattan more than the tax decreases it.
Very good. Thanks, Dan. We're gonna now,
Marty?
yeah. Alec,
Hi.
you wanna close, right?
I'd like to, say a few things at the end, but now I'm trying to reflect on what's been said before me. So I'll probably just stick to what I have in mind. First, it is that we have to always remember and keep in our minds that urban economy is a shared economy. With all the things that we own, actually we live in the shared community. Even though my neighbors don't know who I am over the past 20 years, still, and I don't know them, it is still a shared apartment building. And there are certain norms around use of shared infrastructure. And the same goes to the roads, right? So one of the problems with this, though, is that we're trying to adopt a solution that is and it's not just the congestion pricing, it's just in general the approach. We're trying to keep things as if they were without recognizing that things have changed considerably. The number of even though Denise would say there's been much growth in residential construction over the past 2 years, but in general, over the past 20 years, there's been significant residential growth with more and more residents being added. And what is specific about New York City is that while families may be moving out, new households are formed and move in, especially young professionals, each individual requiring a new place. So that adds not necessarily in personal vehicle traffic, but deliveries or cabs and so on, emergency vehicles. And figuring out how to use streets for that, maybe to Dan's point about parking, not necessarily charging, but making up more space for the deliveries and to let traffic flow is one such ideas. Of course, there's many more that want to come up with public transportation improvements. But then there's another point. Why is it 60th Street and below? It refers to a concept from urban economics, from models from 1960s called central business district. It does make sense because the idea there is that this is the center of all the business activity in this economy and everything sort of converges there. If we look at New York City's gross city product, most of it is generated in Manhattan. But then there's a few more statistics. And that is there are real estate companies and others who are tracking office capacity usage, right? And what we're seeing over the past year, at least this year, on a weekly basis, and I can share that data later, but office capacity usage in New York City is at 47% or 50% at most, right? So that we have a lot of vacant lots. That's number one point. So central business district already starts to fade as this attractive argument. The second point is that derives from this is that some work, I'm not going to say a lot of work or most of work, but some work is being done more and more remotely as far as generating that high value gross city product, GDP of the city. And so that has to be taken into account because as more people work from their homes in Queens, well, that's where congestion is rising. And that's where we need to start introducing congestion pricing as well. Or one might continue the argument, right? And suggest something like that. So this is why, again, we either have to figure out how to, if we go with congestion pricing, probably is to kind of border a city urban border or none at all and start figuring out other ways of sort of coexisting and improving things. But again, this goes back to economists trying to rely on models that are great on paper, but haven't been really tried on a large scale in the metropolitan areas such as New York with its complex geography and socioeconomic profiles. And to Marty's point, probably some type of testing, and maybe it's been done, we don't know, but so it's a reaction really just to the information that is available publicly. So it's just things to consider for us.
Thank you very much, Alec, and thank you to all our distinguished panelists, and of course to the audience for your time and patience. That's it for today. We wish we continued more, but that's all we have time for. And if you can make it tonight, we have another class from 6:30 with Dr. Marty Rowland. It's called Reality Economics. Thank you and have a good one.
Thank you.